This is the point when, if I had remembered it, I would hold up my copy of Edward's book. But Edward is, he's a diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, sort of the elite of the elite of American journalism. He was based in China for a decade. He was the New York Times bureau chief in Beijing. Prior to that, he reported on the Iraq War, was part of a Pulitzer finalist team. Let's just say he's an illustrious journalist. This is his first book. Again, I would be holding it up if I had remembered to bring it from backstage. It's part memoir, part family history, part reportage, and it's all set against the story of modern Chinese history. So it's vast, it encompasses multitudes, but it's also intimate, focused largely on his father and himself. In terms of the writing, it's just got beautiful imagery. The narrative structure is complex and interwoven. And while he tells his story, he manages to draw out large themes like family, nation, empire. So today is a chance for him to talk about some of the themes of his book, and I believe you're going to start with a presentation. Right. All right.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. It's an early session, and on a Saturday, so I'm glad you all made it. I've sat through several sessions here at the Jaipur Literature Festival. Yesterday I was on a panel, and a lot of the themes that seem to be emerging right now are themes about empire, about past empires and current empires. And obviously, this is a subject that I tackle directly in my book, and it's right in the title of my book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few slides that tell the main narrative of my father's time as a soldier in the Communist Army under Mao, and that's a central narrative in the book that gets at the idea of China as an empire that controls these vast territories that extend into Central Asia and right to the border with India, as you know, in the Himalayas. And then the other part of the book, the other half of the book, is about my time in China, reporting on China from 2008 up until 2016 when I left, and then also reporting on U.S.-China relations and intensifying competition between U.S. and China today, which I do in my job as a diplomatic correspondent from Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of themes of the imperial reach of China in the book, as well as the imperial reach of America, too, and where those two intersect and how the two empires intersect in individual people like my father or myself, many Chinese Americans who move back and forth between the two countries. So let's start off. This is the American edition of the book. The one that's for sale here is the British edition, which is also beautiful. They have great covers. And when I was growing up, this is how I knew my family. There was my mother, my father, my sister 2 years younger, myself, and I grew up in a suburb of Washington, D.C. And this is us at the house called Mount Vernon, which is the home of George Washington, the first American president. So it's a very iconic American photo of an American family in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And this is how I knew my father in my youth. All my teenage years, I saw him this way. He put on a uniform every day to go to work at a restaurant, a red jacket, black pants. And I rarely saw him because he worked 6 days a week, very long hours. He would come home late at night, often when I was already going to bed. And then in my 20s, I got more interested in China. I wasn't that interested in my parents' backgrounds in China and Hong Kong when I was growing up. I just wanted to assimilate, I think, into mainstream American culture in the suburbs. And I didn't ask them that much about what it was like in China, and I didn't delve that much into Chinese culture. But then I went to graduate school at Berkeley. Then I went to graduate school at Berkeley, and I started studying Chinese history and politics, and that got me more interested in China. And so in my 20s, when I would go home on breaks from grad studies, I would ask my parents about their past in China. And then one night, my father handed me this photo and put it in my hand. And this is a photo of him in a different uniform. This is a photo of him in the uniform of the People's Liberation Army, taken in 1953 in the far northwest corner of China. And of course, I got intrigued by this, and he told me a story about this photo. He said he had the photo taken when he was in the People's Liberation Army, and then a few years later, after he left the army, he managed to mail it to his father, who was a businessman, a Chinese businessman living in Hong Kong, which was a British colony at the time, as India was at one point. And his father, living in Hong Kong, got the photo and was immediately alarmed by the photo because it had his son in a communist uniform. And on this uniform, originally, there was a red star on the cap. And his father, my grandfather, airbrushed the star out of the photo because he feared that if the British authorities found him with this photo, then there would be reprisals or actions against him. So this is one of the two surviving photos of my father in a PLA uniform, but it's not a complete photo. And so in a way, my delving into his history is me trying to reestablish that red star on the cap and placing him back in the context of communist history in China. He grew up in Hong Kong as a young child. He was born there. As I said, his father was a businessman. They sold herbal medicine, importing it from China at the time in the 1930s and 1940s, and then exporting it to Southeast Asia or selling it in Hong Kong. His family is part of this class of cosmopolitan Cantonese merchants who had ties all across southern China and all across Southeast Asia and did commerce between countries. And then in 1941, the Japanese invade Hong Kong and occupy it as part of their conquest of Asia. And my father and his older brother, Sam, who's here in this photo also, older by 4 years, both get sent to southern China back to their home village in order to seek shelter there. Because while the Japanese were occupying Hong Kong and other British territories in Southeast Asia, like Malaysia, in southern China, the nationalists and the Japanese were still fighting for control. So the Japanese didn't have full control of southern China. So they moved back to their home village. And then my father grew up in the village as Japanese soldiers would come and go. And eventually he goes off to Guangzhou, or Canton back then, the capital of Guangdong province, the large province in southern China, to go to high school. And this is him in Guangzhou with his cousins and other classmates after having gone swimming one day. And at that time, when he's in high school, the Japanese have been defeated, but a different war has resurfaced in China, and this is the civil war between the communists and the nationalists, who were essentially supported by the Americans to a degree. And the communists were winning battle after battle, mainly in northern China. There wasn't as much fighting in the south. Most of the bloodiest battles were in northern China. And then the communists defeat the nationalists in 1949. Mao, in October, proclaims the founding of the People's Republic, moves the capital of China to Beijing in the north. And my father becomes the first, class of high school students. He's in the first class of high school students to graduate into communist-ruled China in May and June of 1950. So he graduates into communist-ruled China, and then he makes a very fateful decision. He, throughout his years in high school, he's heard about the corruption of the nationalist government. He's seen the corruption and the mismanagement himself. He's seen high inflation in southern China. He's seen gambling dens, brothels. He's seen nationalist officials taking bribes as part of their daily work. And so he believes the communists actually are going to rejuvenate China, to restore China to its past glory. And he decides, I'm going to go to university in Beijing because I want to go to the heart of the revolution and see the changes that the communists are bringing to the country and eventually work for the communist cause. Meanwhile, his older brother, Sam, right around this time, he had already graduated from the same high school in Guangzhou, and his brother Sam makes a different decision. He accepts a scholarship to go to America to study, to do engineering studies in America. So he takes off on a ship for San Francisco, while my father gets on a train and goes north to Beijing to start university. This is a map of China. Some of you might be familiar with it, some of you might not be, but if you look down on the far southeast corner, that's Hong Kong and Guangzhou, where my father grew up and went to high school. And then he takes the train all the way across China to the north. You might see a little line up there in north. That's the Great Wall, and Beijing is right up there next to the Great Wall. And incidentally, this map is made by the same map maker who made the maps for the Game of Thrones novels. I commissioned him to make. So, and I think this is the first map he's made of China. And of course, both maps have a wall in the north. So, anyways, my father goes to school. It starts school at university in the fall of 1950. And then on October 1st, 1950, he takes part in a parade in Tiananmen Square marching in front of Mao and other communist leaders because officials have gathered students, factory workers, and soldiers to do this massive military and civilian parade through Tiananmen Square. And he sees Mao waving from the rostrum to the people below. He's inspired by the loyalty he sees around him. And then a few weeks later, he drops out of school and joins the military. Because at this point, Mao has started sending troops into North Korea to fight the American forces on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea is trying to invade and take over the entire Korean Peninsula. And America sent troops to back the South Koreans and push the North Koreans back up towards the border of China. And Mao and Stalin decided that China would get involved in this war. And so Mao is telling all the young people of China, you need to step up and serve your country. If the Americans take over the Korean Peninsula, then they will march onward to Beijing, topple the communist government, and put the nationalists back in power. At this point, the nationalists have retreated to the island of Taiwan and have built essentially a fortress there with American support. So my father signs on to the military believing he has to help fight the American imperialists, and he's very intent on fighting the American soldiers on the Korean Peninsula. So he gets sent to northeast China, and if you look at this map and turn your eyes to the far northeast, you'll see where it's close to Russia, North Korea. You'll see the Korean Peninsula there. It's a very sort of cold and somewhat desolate region. But he goes up there, and this is the homeland of the Manchus who had swept down into China centuries earlier and established the last imperial dynasty of China, the Qing dynasty. But this is their homeland. This is where the Manchus came from. And this is also the border with the Korean Peninsula. So he goes up there and he starts to train in an Air Force academy up there to join the newly formed Air Force because he wants to fly in bomber planes over the Korean Peninsula. And shortly into his training, he is told by military officers, actually, you won't be sent to Korea. We're not going to send you to Korea. What we're going to do is instead put you in an army unit and send you elsewhere in China. You're going to do service for the military, but it's in a different place. And my father at this point is wondering what's going on. He feels something is going off track about his military service. He's not sure why this is. Part of him suspects what's going on is that he had been telling the officials about his background in Hong Kong, growing up in a businessman's family and in a British colony, and then the fact that his brother had taken the scholarship to go study in the US. And so he thinks that at this time there might be some suspicions about his family background because Mao and the Communist Party are actually doing purges throughout China of people who are considered subversives. And it's one of the many campaigns that Mao will carry on throughout his time, but it's a campaign against counter-revolutionaries, against subversives. They're trying to root out people who might harbor loyalties to powers other than China. And so my father gets into a series of trucks, goes back to Beijing, and then the trucks carry him onward into the far west of China, into the far northwest area there. It's called, on the map, you can't read it's probably hard for you to read the letters, but it's an area called Xinjiang, which means new frontier. And it's not far from India. It's actually the closest region to China that China controls to India is Tibet, and Xinjiang is the next region over from Tibet. It borders Central Asia, and it's essentially a part of Central Asia. In Xinjiang, you have many Turkic-speaking people who are Muslims. You have the Kazakhs there. You have Uyghurs, and you have various other people who are not of the ethnic Han majority from interior China, the same ethnicity that my father is. Instead, you have these many different people. And my father then realizes at this point he has been sent into exile because for many centuries, Chinese officials have sent people they did not think were loyal to the empire into this area to serve out their time there. And my father realizes it must have been because of his family background, that he was deemed a subversive and someone who had to be purged, even though he had signed up for the military. And so then he serves out 6 years of military service in this very remote region in Central Asia on the frontiers of China. And it's a time when China has started a military occupation of Xinjiang in order to control the many minority groups that live out there, or many different ethnic groups. They're only minorities perceived by the Han, but of course they're the majority population out there. So he's part of a military occupation of Xinjiang. His job is to both help control the people out there as well as guard the border against the Soviets and against others that are right up against the border. And so part of his initial job is to be sent out to different parts of the region and to indoctrinate different ethnic groups as well as the armed militias in the area into the cause of communism, to help break up the militias, meld them into the People's Liberation Army so that they're no longer these independent militias, and then hope that they serve the communists. So in 2014, I went out to that region because I wanted to try and find traces of what my father and his unit had done out there and see if I could find documents or other things related to the service. And this is the first area he went to called Altai, which is right on the border with Russia and Mongolia. And it's an area of Kazakh nomad herders, and it's very barren. You're up on the Central Asian steppe here. And this is where my father first started trying to indoctrinate Kazakh militias into the communist cause. And he eventually, over 6 years, moves into different parts of Xinjiang. He has a roommate who's a Uyghur Muslim soldier. Some of you might know, recently the very repressive measures that the Communist Party has taken against the Uyghurs in northwest China. But my father got to know many Uyghurs. He started learning the Kazakh and Uyghur languages. And in his final posting, he serves in this area called Wenchuan, right on what's the present-day Kazakhstan border. And this is a photo from that area. It's a very remote area, just like all the others. And at this time, in 1957, he hears a call from the Communist Party for talented youth to go back to interior China if they're out on the frontiers, become educated, finish their education, in order to help industrialize China, because Mao was about to start a program of ambitious industrialization in China. So he takes an exam and then gets to go back into interior China to a place called Xi'an, a former imperial capital, to study there and learn aeronautics engineering. And his goal at this time is to build military aircraft for the Air Force, the one he had never been able to serve in, so that he could support the country that way. Here's him back in Beijing on a holiday break from school with a cousin, and he writes a letter to his older brother Sam, saying China is about to become one of the great world powers again. It's going to be on par with Britain, on par with the United States. You have to come back and help serve China. You've studied in America, you're talented, you're educated. Join me back here in China in order to serve the party, to serve the country, to serve your motherland. And he sends that letter to his parents in Hong Kong, hoping that they'll send it onward to his brother. And this is in the late 1950s. And what happens then is Mao does start his program of industrialization. It's called the Great Leap Forward. And what happens is instead of China becoming a great industrial nation through that program, China instead experiences the worst man-made famine in modern history. When the industrialization policies fail, the economy collapses, and instead 30 to 40 million Chinese die in this famine that takes place. And my father falls ill on his campus. He and his classmates can barely get out of bed on some days. There's no food in the markets, but they survive, unlike many other fellow countrymen and countrywomen. And then my father's also told around this time by communist officials that he can't join the party, that there's something still wrong in the eyes of the party about his family background, and that they have to investigate him even further. And so he starts to get anxious, and he realizes, seeing the famine, experiencing that, seeing the purges of top party officials by Mao, and then hearing this from officials about his own family background, he realizes he has to escape China. And so he makes up an excuse to leave campus, go back down to Guangzhou, where he had gone to high school. And he and his family call on a favor from a police officer, who then gets him a travel document, this document you see on the screen, for him to go to visit the Portuguese colony of Macau, which is bordering Guangdong province and Hong Kong. And so he pretends he's going to Macau just on a tourism trip or to visit people there. Instead, he leaves China permanently, goes to a hotel room in Macau, where his brother, on a visit back from the US, meets up with him, and they finalize his plans to escape to Hong Kong, back to his birthplace of Hong Kong. And after a couple months, he gets permission to go back to Hong Kong, and he re-enters Hong Kong in early 1963 during the Lunar New Year, reunites with his parents. His father passes away later that year. And then he finishes his studies in Hong Kong, and a few years later, in 1967, he takes his grandmother and immigrates to America and joins his older brother in Washington, D.C., where his older brother has been working as an engineer for the U.S. military. So the two brothers had ended up on opposite sides of this geopolitical divide. He in the Chinese military, his brother working for the American military. And this is him in a restaurant in Chinatown where they're celebrating his grandmother's 90th birthday. And he eventually starts waiting tables at the restaurant and working the restaurant. And then he moves out to the Virginia suburbs where I grow up. And he comes back to China on one of his visits, a rare visit, when I become a New York Times correspondent in China, starting 2008, working there. And we make a trip through China together in 2012 when he comes for the birth of my daughter in China. And we go back down to Guangzhou. We meet up with his high school classmates, and he tells me in more detail about some of the stories that you just heard me tell today. And I decide a few years later that I'm going to write this book because I think that there are lessons of history, of empire, of devotion to country that we can learn from my father's story, and that are still very relevant to today, in today's China. So I'll leave you with that, and we can then have a conversation with Steve.
All right, we'll just pass the microphone back and forth. Thank you. You covered a lot of the things I was going to try to get you to talk about, so this is going very well. I want to jump to the big themes, especially the theme of empire, that your title is a very deliberate choice, Edge of Empire. It's hard to overestimate how controversial it is to describe China as an empire today. It is, in the views of the Communist Party, it absolutely is not. Yet this is a term that you decided to use. And a lot of your book takes place in parts of China that are sort of peripheral, out in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, amongst overseas Chinese. So I wonder if you could talk first a little bit about what is China? What was it to your father? What is it to you as a Chinese American? And then what it means to describe China as an empire versus a nation or a culture or something like that.
Right. Thanks, Steve. That's a great question. And Steve himself is an eminent historian of China and has written books set within the context of the Qing Empire, which is the last imperial dynasty of China. And so, Steve, I listened to Steve's earlier talks, and in one of his earlier talks, he said, today the Communist Party obviously rejects the notion of China as an empire. It portrays itself as a victim of empires, of the British Empire, especially because of their seizing of what would become Hong Kong, and then of other empires, the American Empire, the Japanese, and how they forced China to open up treaty ports along its coast. So they portray themselves as a victim of empire. But I firmly believe that China obviously was an empire in the Qing. They conquered Xinjiang, where my father served in the military. They conquered Tibet, though they ruled those regions in very different ways. And they conquered Mongolian areas as well. And those areas, when you put them together, they actually form around a third of the territory of China today. So interior China, what we often think of as China, people of, for example, my ethnicity, is just a very small part is like a part of China, but if you want to look at the map of China today, the territories that were taken by conquest only a few centuries ago make up, what we consider both late imperial China and modern China. And I think the Communist Party is perhaps the one modern power that has managed to hold on, for the most part, to the same territory that one of these great 18th and 19th century empires controlled. Like the British Empire, as we all know in this room, fell apart. There are different independent nations like India today that are part of it, that were part of it, and the Russian Empire fell apart. Putin is trying to reconstitute part of it now, and so did the French and others. But the communists managed to hold on through force, and as my father was part of this project of military occupation of China. So that's why I believe China today can be considered an empire. It uses different means of control in those regions than it does in interior provinces. There's much greater use of security. The budget for the security forces is much greater in those areas, and their methods of technological surveillance are very different in those areas, though they're starting to bring those more into interior China now. So I do believe that there is this form of control that China exerts over much of its territory that allows us to define it as an empire. And of course, China is extending its reach across the world in different ways, in different economic, diplomatic ways. And I think that it's trying to construct itself as a far-reaching global empire using the same means that the Americans did post-World War II. The Americans established themselves as an empire through global diplomatic and military influence around the world. I think China is using that as a blueprint for how they want to establish themselves as a modern-day imperial power or superpower, whatever you want to call it, in the world today. And my father, just to answer that one question, my father believes that China, even today, after all he's been through, I think he and many other people who came from China believe that China should be a great power, that it should be the superpower in the world. They know about the history of China, about its history as an imperial power before the 20th century, and they believe that the reestablishment of China as a central force in the world is something that that should happen and that they can be proud of.
So before we open it up to questions, because I know you're going to have a lot, I wonder if you could say a few words about your experience of being a Chinese-American reporter in China. I mean, I remember back when I first lived in China in the 1990s, I was teaching at a middle school, and our students had a pen pal arrangement with a school in the United States, and they were writing these, I love you, my pen pal, back and forth. And then one of the students in my class found out that his pen pal was Chinese-American, and he got really angry. And he said, no, I want a real American pen pal. But there's sort of, because China it's a nation, it's an empire, it's a territory, it's also a culture and it's an ethnicity.
Yeah.
So in what ways did China feel like home to you? Or in what ways did it feel foreign? In what ways did people there treat you like you belonged or were an outsider?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I feel like there's two different components to that. It's like, how did I conceive of China both before I went there to live there and work as a reporter, and then how did I interact with the country, how did people react to me as a Chinese American? So first, as I said, growing up, I wasn't that interested in China, and I think it's a very arbitrary thing. Some Chinese Americans I know don't get that interested in China. They don't have a strong desire to live there in their adult lives. They're very happy, emphasizing their upbringing in America, the American side of the culture. But then I got intellectually interested in China, and so I went there to study first in 1996 in Beijing, and then I was hooked at that point. I knew I wanted to live and work in China at some point. And so I then fashioned my career so that eventually I would become posted to China as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times. And when I got to China, obviously people, you have a certain sense of familiarity as a Chinese American. You see certain cultural aspects of it that are familiar, practicing traditions around Lunar New Year, seeing the Chinese characters that you see on posters at home, for example. And I had studied the language, so I was somewhat familiar with being able to move around the country. But at the same time, the Chinese government never perceives you as an integrated part of China, which they should not. Like I'm an American first, I'm an American citizen, and so they always perceived me as an American. And as an American journalist, they do harbor suspicions about you. They think that, some officials might think you're a spy, some officials might think you're out there to subvert China or the party, and some officials just see the practice of a free press as inherently counter to the way that the party perceives what journalism is, which is essentially an arm of propaganda. So they might perceive you as an arm of the American government pushing propaganda, even though we're independent journalists.
Right. And just one thing to add, actually, on that theme of sort of today's Chinese government and its attempts to control any kind of sort of dissent, any kind of a threat from outside. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but I've read that China today spends about the same amount of money on domestic security as it does on national defense. Yeah. In a sense that the surveillance of the domestic population is as important as protecting from outside.
That's exactly right, Steve. And the regions I talked about, Xinjiang, Tibet, scholars who studied the expenditures have found that the budget for the security forces and security practices in those regions is much greater than the budget in regions of interior China relative to the size. And so it's pretty amazing that, and I think this gets again to this idea of China as an empire, that it needs to exert some level of coercive or forceful control over other territories where the population is not the majority ethnic Han population, in order to keep those areas within the fold of modern day China, or at least that's their perception. And so I think that this idea of the internal security budget is an important one and helps define, in many ways, what China is today as a nation and how it governs itself. And a lot of those practices, as I said, that were put into place in Xinjiang are now being imported into interior China, especially technological surveillance.
Fantastic. We can start taking questions if their hands. Oh my goodness! All right, there's a lot of them. Maybe start with somebody in the back and then work our way forward. Yeah, sure.
You hear me? Yeah. Thanks for the insightful talk. Edward, my question to you, hypothetically, if you were around in the 1950s and you had to make the choice either go your father's path or his brother's path, what would you have done and why?
That's a hard question. I mean, obviously, in retrospect, you don't want to have lived in China through the Great Famine or the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, especially if your background was had foreign elements in it. But I think my father actually made the decision that many young people in China would have made, which is to serve the country. Because I think that at that time, many young people had seen the misgovernance of the nationalists and had become sympathetic to the communists. And so I think the decision that he made was very much in line with the majority of how young people felt. And many, when I would travel with him to Guangzhou, I met his classmates from 1950. Many of them had joined the military immediately after graduating from high school, just like he had. And some had fought in Korea, others had been sent to other parts of China, but it was very consistent, like the feeling of needing to serve the motherland, needing to protect it from the Americans, these sentiments that my father embraced. So I think that for many, if I had been growing up as a young person in China, I might have gone along that direction.
Okay, great. Next question. The woman over here, if we could give her the microphone. Yeah, you could just hand it down the aisle.
Hi. Thank you for that very insightful conversation. I wanted to ask, through what you've said, the rhetoric of filial piety runs very deeply in Chinese culture, from what you've just said and from my understanding. Is that something that you still see today in modern Chinese society?
I would say that first part again. I missed the first part.
So this rhetoric of filial piety, servitude to the
right, filial
country
piety.
and family and things like that.
Right,
so
right.
Do these ideals still run very deep in modern Chinese society, like today?
I think, with the modernization of China, there's two parts of your question, like the filial piety within families. I think that still exists today more so than that concept exists in, for example, America or Britain. But I do think that there's been some dilution of it. Like the way you practice that today in China is not exactly the same as what people would have shown back in the mid to early 20th century. But you had a bigger idea about filial piety, about loyalty to country and whether that exists in China today. I think that's a very complex question. I think many Chinese, almost all Chinese I've met are very patriotic. They believe in, as I said, as my father did, China as a great power, and that they hope to see China ascend to those heights again. And I think it has reached those heights in the current day. But, when I would go around China, I would often have very complicated conversations with people about governance. Many people saw local officials as corrupt, as not serving the interests of the people, although many of them also believed in the guidance of the leaders in Beijing. And so, to that degree, they did believe in the general direction of China, but they also felt that there was mismanagement and misgovernance at a certain level in China.
Thank you. Maybe one more of the young man in the front here.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for sharing this wonderful story. First, a comment to you, Stephen. The little red book really completes the outfit. Your notebook. It's very very appropriate for your background. Thank you for the story. It's really great to hear about this and then to hear how your family is connected to the history of China and America. Could you speak a little bit more about the Chinese American community and their feelings and connections with both the country of China and the Communist Party? You mentioned your father, and that despite everything that he's gone through, he still very much sees China as a great power. And I know the Chinese American community is a very complex and diverse community. But could you talk a little bit about that and the evolution over recent years?
Yeah.
We're actually out of time.
We're out of
so
time,
it'll have to be
but they
quick.
were saying we should end this 5 minutes early because I have to run to another panel. But I think we still have time for a couple more minutes of conversation, so we'll keep doing it. So first, to answer your question very quickly, it is as you pointed out, it's a very diverse and complex community. There's no single idea that people have about China. There are dissidents within the community who left China who are very much anti-party. There are others in the community who think the party has done well for China up to a certain extent, but that they move to America because they still see more opportunity today in America. I think there's been a slowing of economic growth recently in China. So you see actually like a wave of people trying to immigrate to America today, which I actually was surprised to see in recent years. When I was living in China, I thought, China will never become that country again where you had tons of people trying to get across the borders in America because it's becoming prosperous. But the economic slowdown is real, and people are trying to leave China for other places to find work now. So I think, and then of course there is still pride in China having pulled itself out of the darkest years of both the nationalist era and the Mao era, and then becoming a much more prosperous country. So I think it's a very complicated relationship. We'll take one more question. Do you want to call him?
Yeah, sure. How about the young man? No, actually, no, the woman right back there.
I
with
would
the
request
blue
you to be
scarf
very
on.
brief.
Very, very briefly. And
Sharp
we can
question.
talk to you right after.
My question, Edward, is why is revisionism such a compelling universal behavior pattern across big powers, Russia, China, looking to revise and hark back to the grand old era? Why is that phenomenon so thriving?
You mean the phenomenon of great power, what the Americans call great power competition?
Yeah, revisionism. Russia looking to rebuild the great Russian Empire, Chinese looking to avenge the century of humiliation. What is that about?
I'm sorry, your first part was, what is? The micro, I couldn't
This
hear it.
great tussle among powers for rebuilding the great old
Right.
era.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is the sense, I mean, I think that it's almost inevitable that when you have superpowers who ascend to this level of wealth and of military power and diplomatic power, that they come into conflict to a certain degree. And of course, you had the Cold War starting in the 1950s between the Soviet Union and the US. And of course, there's an ideological foundation to that conflict as well. I think with China, there is also an ideological component in the competition, because I think up until now, the Americans have never trusted a country with the type of political system that China has, the authoritarian one-party political system. And so they have always suspected that if a country wields the amount of power that China has today in that type of system, then there will be a natural sense of opposition to the US. And I think that that's part of the bedrock of the competition today, besides the practical aspects of who wields more power in the world. But of course, democracy is being challenged in the US today, and I think it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens if the US moves closer to an authoritarian government, style government in itself, whether it will feel more kinship with a country like China.
Yes.